Why do we need live local theater and poetry in the 21st century? How do we get the words off the page, onto the stage, and into the hearts and minds of audiences? How do we get audiences to give us their live attention when the drama on the screen is better than it's ever been? Celebrity-studded, better funded, and better marketed than anything you or I can produce locally. This is Running Lines. These are some of the questions we'll be asking. It's 2020, and Shakespeare is still the most produced playwright in the United States. Why? That's what we're going to be asking today on Running Lines. This is my co-host, Mark Dentsevich.
No. Milton Howitzer. That's the name
I guess he's going to change his name every show, so that's something to look forward to.
Milton Howitzer. It sounds,
I like that name.
It's a good name. It sounds like a serious journalist.
All right, let me finish the introduction. Okay. And we have guests from Little Theatre of Wilkes-Barre's recent production of King Lear. We had the opportunity to see it a few weeks ago. Mark was in it. Eric Glutz played Edmund,
yes.
Right? And David Parmalee was the director of that production. And you're also on the board of Little Theatre, or?
Yes, that's right. I've been
Okay.
general manager for a few years, as the chair of the all-volunteer board, 15-person board.
Okay.
Yeah.
And my name is Alicia Grega. Let's go back to this question. Why is Shakespeare so often produced in 2020 when we have access to more scripts, more work by more playwrights than ever? A whole bunch of stuff just went into the public domain recently. Why Shakespeare?
That's an easy one for me to answer. He's the best playwright who ever lived in the English language. And I think we're fortunate as native English speakers to have him, in that we can appreciate him most easily. He also wrote an awful lot of plays, which is to his advantage,
Right.
Dozens and dozens. But I think the work stands up. I think his understanding of human nature and his ability to use the language to express that understanding so beautifully and so well has stood the test of time better than anybody else.
Well, you know, and I think that's an important point, because there's some plays that were written and they're dated, and so you do them today and they don't have the same meaning or same connotation. But Shakespeare, even though, you know, it was however long ago,
Right.
doesn't seem dated. Like, the references are still applicable to what we do, even if it is, you know, in an antiquated way of speaking.
Mm-hmm. You know, some more pessimistic responses I got on Facebook. I put a question out there. Was it is public domain, so no royalties, relatively inexpensive, and what would
What's
another
a
one be?
trade-off?
Yeah,
It's a
it is.
trade-off. If you get public domain, but then you get less of an audience than you do with Fiddler on the Roof.
Right. There's a double-edged sword. I think we talked about that previously in our conversations about people are afraid of Shakespeare. It's a familiar name, so it's a draw. So people are like, I know who that is. I'll go see that play. I know it's going to be good because it's Shakespeare, but
My
then,
sister wouldn't come.
right. Well, your production recently was 3.5 hours long, and that was with some cuts. Tell us a little bit more about your production of King Lear and King Lear itself. It's a good example for us to talk about when we're talking about why is Shakespeare so good.
Sure. There are probably half a dozen Shakespeares that are well known and liked and are easy to watch, relatively speaking. Midsummer Night's Dream, Romeo and Juliet, the Scottish play, we'll say by tradition, Macbeth, since we're not in the theater,
superstitious.
Hamlet to a certain extent. And then it starts to go this way. And they're the ones we read in high school. When I was in high school, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Hamlet. You get to something like King Lear, which I believe, though Hamlet is the best written play ever, I think King Lear is a bigger play.
You totally skipped the comedies there. Did you notice that,
Yeah,
guys?
well, Midsummer Night's Dream, yeah. As You Like It,
Merchant of Venice.
Much Ado About Nothing.
Much Ado About Nothing, exactly. These are plays people know. But there's a whole lot more in the
Winter's
Shakespearean
Tale.
canon people don't know. And Lear is certainly not a big draw because it's violent, it's brutal.
No wind, rain, fire, and thunder are my daughters. I tax you not, you elements, with unkindness. kingdom called you children. There owes me no subscription. Here I stand, your slave, a poor, wretched, infirm, despised old.
For centuries, people seldom produced it. It was thought to be too dark.
There was an alternate ending for
They
a long
wrote
time,
happier
wasn't it? They had a
endings.
happier ending, and then they finally restored it back to
Yes,
their
Cordelia
original-
survives
Yeah.
and takes the throne because
know
it's
that.
it's fairly bleak. Yeah, not condoned by the author, but people did it.
I learned that in my research for this show.
But people like Nietzsche called it Shakespeare's most modern play because it suits the things we have seen in our time and the worldview people have taken, which during the 20th century, with so much violence, political upheaval, oppression, genocide, I mean, all the things we've seen that would have been difficult for Shakespeare to imagine 400 years ago. Something like Lear maybe doesn't seem so bad, but we cut it about 33%. And I hoped to run 3 hours with intermission, and we ran about 3 hours plus intermission. You don't really know until you put it together. So we
Right.
tested the audience's endurance a little bit.
Well, and we added that one scene that
Yes.
that was purely, for the music and the
Yes.
right.
We added some fighting, some stunts, some physical things. Because of our concept in producing it, we changed the whole setting and era of the play.
I think that's also another appeal to producing Shakespeare is that you have that license to do whatever you want with it.
Yes.
And changing the setting is a great example. It's one of the things that I think makes Shakespeare more fun and enjoyable because I don't think I'd want to watch a play where they were, doing it pure Elizabethan, like in corsets and doublets and accents that I couldn't understand. The
Yes.
language is tricky to understand, but you guys do such a good job at it because you know what you're saying, we know what you're saying, and we can follow even if we don't think that we're going to be able to understand Shakespeare when we walk into the theater.
Well, I have to say that, we did Hamlet, and I was lucky enough to do that with David a few years ago. And I was saying to my fellow actors, and I don't know if I told you this as well, I liked doing King Lear better than I liked Hamlet. And Hamlet is my favorite Shakespeare show. But I preferred our version of King Lear to Hamlet, and I was pleasantly surprised by that. And I think it's because of all the added things that we put into it. The moving set pieces, the stunts. It was more of a physically challenging show, and I think that is what can endear it to the audience more because it's not so wordy. You actually get to see, something dynamic that's visual.
When I talked to you before the production, you said Lear is plot, not thought.
Yes, it's about, you said that better than I did. That Hamlet is about the language, Lear is about the action, but plot, not thought is much better. I'm going to say that from now
Isn't
on.
that what you said?
You took it
made
to
it
the
up.
next level, way up. That's brilliant because
Okay.
it rhymes, which people remember.
Sure.
But it positively is.
Gloucester, the imposter.
Yes, not an imposter.
I use that as an example in my effective speaking class this week about when you're introducing someone who has a difficult to remember name, find something that rhymes with it. And I used Gloucester the imposter as an example of me mispronouncing a name, and I'll never do it again.
He's on the roster, as we know. But we were surprised as we started to rehearse it. Having done Hamlet, I was very wary of the impact of the language. But the actors made it their own right away. The language is not nearly so dense as it is in some other Shakespeare. But it is 400 years old. So the gift you get with a cast like this, and both of these actors in major roles, is their ability to bring the words to the audience based on what they're doing and how they're saying it. And my new quote about Eric that I developed during this show is, Eric does Shakespeare like he's ordering a pizza. It's just so natural coming out of his mouth. And Mark had a different approach, but similar in its effect, where it sounded like him telling us something that it was important for us to know. So the actors carry that antiquated vocabulary to the audience.
Right.
And that's what actors are so good at. And I think people in the audience who weren't following all the dialogue were following the action because of what they did for us.
And in updating the play to the Woodstock era, you didn't change the language. There was no, that's groovy, it's the pigs or anything,
The pigs.
right? It was the costumes, it was the set, the music,
Right.
which was an amazing element. Tell us a little bit about the music for that, because it was so cool.
But I am so glad you liked it, and you interacted with it as much as anybody,
Right.
Partly because of that scene. And whenever his character, who is among the 2 or 3 most evil in dramatic literature, would come on the stage, there was we went to a minor key, but we had Matt Bennick, who's a local blues guitarist, a rock guitarist. He's fantastic, professional musician. Just come in and sit to the side of the stage with one Stratocaster and play. And not songs, but music he was improvising as he went along. So he played before curtain, at intermission, during scene changes, and underscoring the action where there was no dialogue, and occasionally where there was dialogue. And he was just brilliant. He was. And he didn't get to come in with us until just a few days before we opened. But by the time we opened, it was one of our favorite parts, I think.
Right.
The
It was
one-
nice listening to it backstage too.
Yeah.
The one moment I really loved was that that Jimi Hendrix inspired bit when they're carting the dead bodies in. Tell me about that choice.
Well, the plot of Lear involves Cordelia, his rejected daughter, going to France and deciding, how can I help out Dad, because she has now become Queen of France. And her decision is to invade, which is a very feminist character 400 years ago.
Thanks for saying that, yeah.
Yes, we're going to join the French army and bring an expeditionary force and invade. And she explains, I'm not doing it because I want territory. I'm doing it for my father.
But love, dear love, in our aged father's right. Soon shall I see and hear him.
And it's just a marvelous moment. So in between the end of scene A and the beginning of scene B, the French lose. So I had written at the top of the page, music indicates British victory. So here's a musician who read that, and Eric and my son Michael were in a wonderful fight scene where 2 commandos take out the entire French camp. With no lines, we simply inserted it. And he had underscored that with wonderful, a whole lot of heavy chords. And it turns into the Hendrix version of God Save the Queen.
Right, which as far as we know, Jimmy never played, but that's what it would have sounded like.
We all
Yeah.
remember that national anthem. I mean, it is the piece of music from Woodstock. So
Yeah.
I thought, brilliant,
It was great.
brilliant choice.
Yeah, I loved that. We also talked about music in terms of Bob Dylan and the kind of divide with the counterculture that was going on at that time, and the parallel between that and what's going on in our country right now, which is more divided than I remember ever seeing it pretty much in my lifetime. Did you have anything you wanted to say about that, any of you guys? I think that's a reason that we can use Shakespeare to comment on today, even though it's 400 years old.
Just that Lear and Gloucester and Kent, I think you can consider them the establishment, and the younger people were the counterculture, anti-establishment hippies.
Yeah.
I guess. That's what I was thinking.
Who's
of.
Edmund in that?
His mother didn't like his character.
I made a joke that the blazer that you were wearing was very like Aleister Crowley, and I wanted to see like the Satanist pentagram from like Rosemary's Baby or something. But I don't. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Maybe you're not that evil.
Well, actually, you know, in doing my research, I was researching, and they said that Edmund is actually one of the more sympathetic villains in Shakespeare's, you know, pantheon of characters. But I would say that he is definitely, you know, a revolutionary who goes out there and, you know, he fights for what he thinks is right, regardless of whether that's good or bad. he felt slighted. He felt that he was not getting what he deserved. And, even though he was an evil character, he went and he defended his country, even though, he worked against his father. He worked against that for personal reasons, but he did have that sort of allegiance to Britain as a whole.
Eh,
You don't think so?
no, you're probably right. I'm just looking at it from my point of view, from Gloucester's
Wow.
point of view.
And he's the father,
Yes.
right?
And he couldn't look at anything anymore after
father,
a while.
son.
I was watching Criminal Minds on Monday, and I turn it on, and the first thing I see is this guy with the blowtorch blinding another guy. And I thought, wouldn't that have been spectacular, to blind me with the blowtorch?
Yeah, right.
Did they have blowtorches?
In '69 they did.
Oh, good point. Good point. See, that's what you can do
Very
when
dramatic,
you update
don't you
it.
think?
Great. So I was doing some research, like I said, before this show, and I was looking at a book called Directing Shakespeare in America, Current Practices. In it, Charles Ney interviewed more than 60 artistic directors and directors. The book came out in February 2016. And in it, Brian Kulick says, one of the great things about Shakespeare is that we don't know how it was done. We don't know how it was made. It's allowed us to come back to him and try to reimagine. We have to. It's foolish to think that we can do Shakespeare the way Shakespeare was done. It's impossible. So I'm just going to throw that out there for anybody who gets critiqued for not being true to the playwright's intentions, as they say.
One thing we do know is he was very popular, and he wrote for several levels of theater goers at once. People who appreciated literature. Certainly the language is beautiful. It requires the mind of a poet to appreciate. But at the same time, it's full of dirty jokes and a lot of clowning around and a lot of low humor for people who had come to the theater just to have a good time. And they've done a lot of archaeology around where the globe was. And they found nutshells, like people would come and buy nuts and eat them. And it was like going to the movies.
Texas Roadhouse.
Yeah, exactly.
The women sold oranges.
Yeah.
I read that recently
Yeah.
to get in, and there was like no good reason for a woman to be at the theater at that time. They weren't allowed on stage. They were usually trying to pick up dates, or they sold oranges.
Yeah.
It's directors, though. How many directors try to stick close to what the playwright had in mind? And most directors have their own idea.
That's
For
kind of
the
one of
most
those
part-
etiquette rules of theater, right? What did the playwright intend? You can interpret
You interpret
to a
it, though.
point, but if you go contrary to the playwright's intentions, you're going to get slack from the theater community.
You think?
Right?
I don't know. I don't know. It depends. The last time I brought up Henry V, and I said it was made into a movie with Laurence Olivier in the 40s in England, and they were at war, so it was a pro-war movie. And then when Kenneth Branagh made it in the late 90s, it was anti-war. It looked at it a totally different way. So who knows what Shakespeare's intent was? But these directors took it and made it their own.
Well, that was my thought with the Woodstock Lear. That the point of Lear, I was taught in 1977, is you can't divide the kingdom. If you divide the kingdom, you're inviting chaos. Well, Lear's first act when he steps on stage is to divide the kingdom. You open the play, and 2 minutes later, the king is coming, and he divides the kingdom, and chaos results instantly.
The king is coming!
Attend the lords of France and Burgundy, Gloucester. Know that we have divided in three our kingdom, and 'tis our fast intent that we should shake all cares and business from our age, conferring it on younger strengths.
And that was their thought pattern, that they believed in the fact that the king had been heavenly ordained to lead the kingdom. You can't divide the kingdom. So I looked at the United States, which for a long time was divided over various issues, but in my lifetime, I have watched since, we'll call it the 60s, divide into culture, counterculture. And one of the iconic events of what I see as that divide continuing today was Woodstock, where we had a gathering of the tribes, where traditional America, square America, as we said at the time, looked at that and said, oh, good Lord, what is that? And suddenly it had all coalesced into one field in New York with 500,000 or so people, and it got the world's attention. And of course, it's thought of as a very beloved event by people who were there or who watched it happen alive then. I was just a little kid. But we watched it signify a big, big change. And I think that change has only widened since then. And I saw some of those sounds in King Lear. I heard Bob Dylan lyrics. I heard Neil Cassidy with his kind of speed-fueled rants that he would do in the voice of Edgar. And I saw that divide.
Edgar, he was on something, huh?
Oh my gosh, we worked very hard on that. So I kind of heard those echoes, and I thought, there's a way to treat it. Pretty good this year, 50th anniversary of Woodstock, 50th anniversary of the moon landing, which is maybe our greatest communal achievement as Americans, traditional America. And they were a few weeks apart, the moon landing and Woodstock.
And those vision choices give you ideas. Just as an audience member watching Lear go mad, I was like, he's on acid or something, right? Somebody slipped him some acid. Because it was he went on this trip and then he kind of came back at the end after it was too late to really do anything about it.
Yes. God
now,
bless
that
Kevin.
wasn't the choice that you guys made,
Right.
but it could have been, and it would have worked.
Right.
And it would have fit the vision and I think what Shakespeare was doing with the story. I don't think, it would have been contrary.
No.
They don't really explain Lear's madness.
Right.
Oh, they don't, do they?
No,
They
and
don't.
it's quick. Kevin Costley and I sat down and looked at the gear changing going on there. God bless him. I mean, what he dealt with. Lear would go from strong to weak, from sane to insane in one monologue.
Right.
He would explore all 4 quadrants of Lear, and he was able to manage that, which as an actor is.
When you said you think Lear went from strength, did you really ever think
Yeah.
that he was strong? Because I actually view him as a weak character because he's always going from one daughter to another. He gives up all his power at the beginning.
Right.
I just feel like he's like in this downward angle. You know
No
what I mean?
question, yeah. But strength as far as expressing his intent or trying to control his environment or being powerful, showing power, and then suddenly becoming that very weak king who's chasing a mouse around with a bit of cheese.
Ooh, a mouse. A mouse. Oh, peace, peace, peace. A piece of cheese will do it.
I know that voice.
Gotta roll with the beard. They did flatter me like a dog, saying aye and nay, whatever I said. And the rain did come to wet me, and the wind did make me chatter, and the thunder would not silence at my bidding. There I found them out. There I spilled them out. Go to. They were not men of their words. Go to. He said I was everything. 'Tis a lie. And I am not a Jew.
Is it not the king?
Oh, I every inch a king. Oh, see how my subjects tremble before me. You, sir, I will pardon you, sir. What was your cry?
So strong maybe in the dramatic sense.
Okay.
That's why he can't give up the 100 men.
Yeah.
Because he needs their power.
Yes.
That's interesting to think of it that way.
Yeah, very much about that.
And the sisters, though, I'm assuming he didn't think of them as being evil at all or having any issues. They kind of get that way later on once they get all the power, they get the land and whatever, because otherwise he wouldn't have given them all that if he thought that they were going to do what they did.
Yeah, Lear and Gloucester, a subplot that's almost as big as the plot. Amazing to pull that off in one play. Both instantly regret terribly bad decisions based on a complete
Right.
misevaluation of their own families. They put faith in the wrong person and almost destroy entirely
Right.
the person who's loyal to them based on misleading information, and they live to regret it very, very quickly.
But Gloucester
Terrible
had
judgment.
no idea. He
No
had
idea.
no idea.
Yeah.
He felt about Edmund the same way he felt about Edgar,
Yeah.
and he says that. So if Edmund tells him something, he's going to believe it.
Right.
He has no reason not to believe it.
A credulous
And
father.
you showed me a letter. You had a letter.
There's a lot of letters.
If it's,
There were a lot of letters.
if it's on
My
the internet,
3
it
by
must
4
be
crop
true.
letters.
Oh, we had a stack of letters.
So why wouldn't I? So yeah, I could see that, but I never understood why Lear was just so willing to give everything away like that.
Yeah,
It's one of the things the actor has to figure out.
right. And it had never been done.
Right.
So
One of the things that Shakespeare does for me also is 400 years ago, we know that people were just as bad and rotten and violent and evil as they are today. It's not new, because you hear people talk about what the world has come to and how dangerous their neighborhoods are. But the world isn't worse. People are still people. They're, if anything, I think we're a little more behaved,
Right.
depending on who you talk to. So what do you think about that idea?
Well, I would agree with you. Actually, my
Yeah.
mother, when she came to see the show, she's like, "I love the show. I didn't like you." She's like, she made that point. You know, you lived up to your name, but she said, you know, in that time, you know, it was a little more lawless, and so if you wanted something and you grasped for it, like that's what happened. You know, kings switched every few generations because, you know, somebody under them was grasping at that, and so it was a very, very, you know, violent time with, you know, and I think you're right to your point that, you know, now we have more laws to kind of regulate that, even though, you know, people are still, you know, well, I don't want to say the word evil, but, you know, like they can be that way within the confines of what society has now.
Yeah. Yeah. My wife likes to say, people are the same.
Yeah.
They don't change their basic nature.
Right.
Their culture changes, their habits change, their tastes change. But if you read, going back to the Old Testament or Shakespeare or today's newspaper, human nature and its good and bad directions has remained pretty constant.
Yeah.
Society
Even the
has
Bible,
changed.
right?
Yes,
People
exactly.
were horrible.
Yeah, we can still relate to the parables in the gospel because we go, yeah, I could see why they would feel that way. Of course, they still make sense to us.
Yeah.
Because people are the same.
Yeah. And so Shakespeare will show us that, the darkest side, right?
Yes.
And in the same play, we'll see beautiful moments of tenderness and generosity of spirit.
Right.
I think my favorite scene, I'm going to have to say, was
Me.
Gloucester and Lear.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
And in their, you know, here's these two old men who've just come down. They've been knocked down the
Yes.
ladder, and they're consoling each other, kind of in an old friend kind of way. But it's so beautiful, especially after, you know, hearing Kevin's madness going on for a while, and then you're like, it's a completely different tone, and it was done so well, I thought.
Oh, thank you. The final scene is almost automatic, where the dead Cordelia is brought in, and Lear is left to live to mourn her. And it starts with howl, 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 howl. He does that a lot.
That's Ginsberg.
Yeah, exactly. But he'll give Lear a word repeated 4, 5, 6 times. He says the word kill, and you're seeing 6 times. It's an actor's playground. But there are 15 people on stage in our version, and only Lear moving in that final scene.
Oh, you are men of stone. If I had thy tongues and thine eyes, I would make such noise as the bolts of heaven would crack.
And many other people have died at the same time. There's 3 dead women on stage, all 3 sisters. And the actors would cry watching it, even though they had rehearsed it 50 times. But the scene that I think I was perhaps touched by in a unique way was exactly the one you mentioned, between Lear and Gloucester, because it just developed as we did it. And I assumed they were old friends.
Yeah,
They were drinking buddies, as it were.
That's what I assumed
Both
too.
of them
We were.
broken, just smashed by life and by their own bad decisions. Gloucester now blind, Lear insane, and consoling one another. And Lear does almost all the talking.
Five! Oh, give me an ounce of civet, good apothecary, to sweeten my imagination. Here, there is money for thee.
Oh, let me kiss that hand.
Oh, no. Let me wipe it first. It smells of mortality.
But you did it so well.
It's just listening to him, knowing that he's losing his mind or has lost his mind, knowing all the things that he has gone through.
Right.
So that just hits me emotionally because it's emotional.
Yeah, and you're wearing sunglasses.
And I'm wearing
Yeah. One thing that made it work, we staged what I thought was a really effective suicide. Gloucester tries to commit suicide, but his son deceives him by saying you're on a cliff when he is not. So he simply falls to earth and wakes up, and then his good son, Edgar, convinces him that his life has been miraculously spared. So we staged a trust fall with the ensemble, where Mark falls backwards, blind, from a 3-foot platform on stage. And he's elevated quite a bit from the audience, so he's way up there from the audience's point of view.
That was real brave, Mark.
Yeah, I thought I would not have done it.
It was beautiful.
Thank you. And we thought it was too, and they catch him. Well, that platform 3 feet in the air is what he and Lear sit on to talk afterwards, and their feet dangle. Well, when 2 men are talking with their feet dangling, suddenly we're back to grade school.
Yeah.
You know, we don't sit that way. So it changed the whole perspective on
Yeah.
that relationship, and it took them almost back to a whole different stage of life. And I thought it produced great sympathy, and that was by accident. We thought, oh, we'll put them on the
except
platform.
it is there. It's there
Yeah.
in the script. It's that purity, that innocence of that scene that you just found a way to communicate it visually, which
Great
is
moment
what
between-
theater should do. I mean, we start with the text, but we have to put that on stage in a way that it communicates visually what's
Yes.
And
happening.
you want to create moments. You want to create these things.
Yeah. And 2 very fine actors doing just that. That's why we don't call it talking. We call it acting, right?
Right, exactly.
They brought
Good
it
point.
across, yeah.
All right, to go the other way, I want to hear some favorite lines. I'm kind of tied between, I think the world's asleep, which Lear says early on, right? It's Lear? And you hear it and you're like, yeah, that's one of those lines that I forgot Shakespeare wrote. And then, I shall do such wretched things, which
Yeah, that's your favorite.
I think,
I don't know what they
I
are.
might have to go with that
know
one.
not what they are, right? Because he has the ability to do nothing at that point.
Yeah.
It's complete impotent rage. Yeah.
But it's just great to hear it, to hear words like that. So, what do you got?
Not me, not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
So mine was actually not one of my own lines. you being an actor backstage, you're so concerned about what you have going on. But so when I actually finally got to a point where I didn't have to do that, I was able to listen. And so the Fool, who actually I think is the most sane person in the show, who was the most level-headed, giving the best advice throughout the entire show.
Learn more than thou throwest. Stand less than thou throwest. Leave thy drink and thy whore deep in the door.
And I'm paraphrasing, but he said to Lear, I know why a snail has a house. And Lear's like, well, why does a snail have a house? It's to put his head in, not to give it away to his daughters. And that just struck me backstage. And I was surprised that the audience didn't hear me laughing, because I burst out laughing in the wings. It was. And I was like, well, that's really, it's insightful. Like, why did you do that? You're an idiot.
That's really modern sounding too.
Right.
That's like a joke I could hear in a,
Right.
buddy comedy next week.
Well, they do a whole series of kind of knock-knock jokes.
Right.
Where the Lear asks a question and Lear says, no, what? And then he tells him the answer. And in every answer, he's twisting the knife, pointing out to Lear what an idiot he's been. And they're great sequences. That's probably the best.
Who's here? A wise man and a fool.
Right. Exactly.
Rob Klubeck did a really great job. He was
marvelous
so funny.
comedic actor. Rob does improv, an
Yeah.
improv group. And every night it was watching him do improv with a script.
Right.
It felt that way.
That's good to keep
Yeah.
it fresh, sure.
Yeah.
All right, you got a favorite line?
Yes. After Lear goes mad and they take him to a farmhouse to recover, he decides to put his daughters on trial. And he thinks they're there.
Okay.
And he sets up 2 stools and he's instructing the Fool and Edgar and Kent to try them. And you be the prosecutor and you be the jury. And they're playing along. And at one point he says to the Fool, ask her who she is. He says, is your name Goneril? And Lear says, she cannot deny it. And the Fool says, cry you mercy, madam. I took you for a joint stool. I thought you were just a piece of furniture, which, of course, it is.
It was, yeah.
It's such a kind and sweet way for this comedian to express the hopelessness of the situation. His master, his king, has entirely lost touch with reality. And apparently it was a thing they said. If you miss someone at a party and they say, hey, did you know I was here? They would say, oh, I took you for a joint stool. I thought you were part of the furniture. And we sort of say it today. You came out of the wallpaper or whatever.
Oh, what's a joint stool?
Yeah. A stool joined together by a joiner, by a carpenter.
Oh.
Yeah.
I thought it was.
Yeah, your typical 3-legged stool.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I mean, I know how it's used in the context, but I
Right.
was always wondering, what is a joint stool?
Right.
Compared to like a bar stool or,
That's it.
Right.
Yeah.
And Mark, we picked yours for you because Gloucester's lines
It's
in
my
this
line.
passage really inform the play, but also just really resonate today as well. And it's a good example of why we do Shakespeare.
These late eclipses of the sun and moon portend no good to us. Love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide. In cities, mutinies. In countries, discord. In palaces, treason. And the bond cracked twixt son and father. We have seen the best of our times. Oh, wait, now I got to see the rest of it. Damn it, Dale. We have seen the best of our times. We could cut this. We have seen the best of our times. Machinations, hollowness, treachery, all ruinous disorders follow us disquietly to our graves.
Or maybe we'll just leave it in because that's what we would do in the play.
Well, then if they cut it, you're wearing your glasses now and you weren't before.
They magically appeared.
I love that too, because it expresses such pessimism about the times. Look how bad it is. It
Right.
couldn't get any worse.
Right. That's what I was kind of saying before
Yeah.
too. Like we think it's so bad now, but
Yeah.
everybody thinks it's so bad.
Right.
Right.
And Shakespeare had never met Stalin, for example. It could get worse. But it's difficult to remain optimistic in the face of everything going on at any given time.
Except in every tragedy, somebody's left standing at the
Not
end.
you.
Right? And in Lear, it's Edgar
Edgar.
and Kent
Yes.
Kent
And Albany.
and
the-
Albany.
Albany, yes.
Albany.
Although Kent is probably not long for after
No,
the show.
Kent
right.
refuses. Albany says, you two rule and heal the hurt kingdom. And Kent says, not me, I must follow my master. And there's great debate about what's going to
What
happen.
that
Is he
means,
gonna
yeah.
commit suicide? But he's certainly not going to rule. Same thing happens in Hamlet, where Fortinbras, who's a foreigner, comes into the kingdom and he's going to take over. And there's 7 bodies on stage. In Lear, there's 3 on stage and a couple off stage. But hope springs eternal.
Yes, here,
Did you
Horatio,
run-
tell my story.
Yeah.
Did you run that scene in Jazz Hamlet?
Yes, we kept
okay.
Fortinbras. A lot of people cut him for time.
Oh yeah, Jerry Godwin
Yeah.
did, because he said,
Yeah.
as soon as Hamlet dies, nobody cares what happens after that.
Well, Shakespeare felt the need to knit things up. So
But
that,
he
you
does
know,
that a lot, though.
Yeah,
The
he does
denouement.
that. Yeah, yes, exactly.
Well, I wish we did cut it because I was dead on that stage a long time with all that blood in Hamlet. It was a long time.
It's true. But one of the great things about Lear is that both characters, Gloucester and Lear, do get to reunite with the children they've so terribly wronged and betrayed. And they get to forgive and forget.
Right.
And the greatest regret is the regret of Judas. You know, Judas never came back and asked forgiveness. He could have,
Right.
but he didn't, because he
Not a Lear character.
Yeah, the actual Judas, just
Yeah.
despair. You know, I can't make amends. I can't be forgiven. I can't mend those fences. And both characters do manage to ask forgiveness and be given forgiveness and mend the fence. So the positive thing we can take out of Lear is, you know, don't have regrets. Go fix it.
All right.
You have time.
And I think we're out of time. So thank you for joining us today. We'll be back next month with a conversation about women in theater for Women's History Month.